In the shadowed heart of an impossible maze, something waits. Not merely an animal, not quite human. It is a creature born from divine wrath and unnatural desire, a living testament to the terrible price of defying the gods. This is not the monster of children's tales. This is something far more disturbing, a being whose very existence represents one of mythology's darkest secrets. Deep beneath the palace of Knossos, in the labyrinthine corridors of the most infamous prison ever conceived, prowls the Minotaur. But the creature itself is only the beginning of this tale. To understand the true horror of the beast of Crete, we must ascend into the twisted origins of its birth, the cursed architecture that contains it, and the ritual sacrifices that feed its hunger. This is a story of divine punishment, royal hubris, and the monstrous offspring that resulted from humanity's greatest transgression against the natural order. The name Minotaur itself tells us everything we need to know about this creature's identity. In ancient Greek, Minotauros means quite literally the bull of Minos, marking this beast not as some random monster, but as the personal curse of Crete's most powerful king. On the island itself, the creature was known by another name, Asterion, the Starry One, a title that hints at the cosmic significance of its existence. This was not merely a local legend. This was a creature whose birth shook the very foundations of divine and mortal law. The tale begins not with the monster, but with an act of supreme arrogance that would doom an entire bloodline. King Minos of Crete was a ruler whose power stretched across the wine-dark Aegean, whose fleets commanded trade routes from Egypt to the Black Sea. But power, as the Greeks understood all too well, breeds hubris, and hubris inevitably draws the attention of the gods. Each year, Minos was required to perform a sacred duty to Poseidon, the Earthshaker, god of the seas that brought Crete its wealth. The ritual was simple but absolute. The king must sacrifice the most beautiful bull born in his herds to the god who controlled the waves upon which his kingdom's prosperity depended. For years, Minos had faithfully performed this obligation, understanding that his covenant with the sea god was the foundation of his power. But then came the year when Poseidon sent forth a bull of such extraordinary beauty that it took the breath from every man who gazed upon it. Its hide was the pure white of sea foam, its form perfect beyond mortal comprehension. This was no ordinary animal. This was the Cretan bull, a creature so magnificent that it seemed to embody the divine essence of the god himself. And when Minos looked upon this marvel, something dark stirred in his heart. The king's desire for the beautiful bull overcame his fear of divine retribution. Perhaps he believed his power made him untouchable. Perhaps he thought the gods would not notice his deception. Whatever his reasoning, Minos made a choice that would echo through the ages. He kept the sacred bull for himself and sacrificed a lesser animal in its place, believing he could cheat the very god who ruled the depths of the ocean. Poseidon's reaction was swift and terrible. The god who could split mountains with his trident and drown entire cities beneath the waves did not strike at Minos directly. Instead, he chose a punishment far more subtle and infinitely more cruel. He would not destroy the king's body. He would destroy his bloodline through an act so unnatural, so fundamentally wrong, that it would birth a monster to haunt Crete for generations. The target of the god's wrath was Pasiphae, Minos' queen, a woman whose divine heritage made her curse all the more significant. She was the daughter of Helios, the god who drove the chariot of the sun across the sky each day, and the Oceanid nymph Perse. Divine blood flowed through her veins, making her not merely a mortal woman, but a being connected to the cosmic order itself. When Poseidon chose to corrupt her, he was striking at the very heart of divine law. The curse that fell upon Pasiphae was perhaps the most twisted punishment ever devised by an Olympian god. Poseidon filled her heart with an overwhelming, maddening desire for the very bull her husband had refused to sacrifice. This was not mere attraction. This was an all-consuming lust that drove her to the edge of madness, a supernatural compulsion that violated every natural law and social boundary. Day and night, the cursed queen was tormented by her unnatural longing. She could think of nothing but the magnificent white bull, could find no peace in her royal chambers, no comfort in her children's company. The curse ate at her soul like poison, transforming the proud queen of Crete into a creature driven by desires that should not exist in any rational mind. Desperate for relief from her torment, Pasiphae turned to the one man on Crete whose genius might provide a solution to her impossible predicament. Daedalus, the master craftsman, inventor extraordinaire, and architect without equal, was summoned to the palace in secret. He was a man whose skill was legendary across the Mediterranean, whose workshops produced wonders that seemed to blur the line between human achievement and divine magic. When Pasiphae confessed her cursed desire to Daedalus, the craftsman found himself at the center of a moral crisis that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He could refuse the queen's request and face her royal wrath, or he could use his incredible skills to enable an act that violated every principle of natural law. The decision he made would not only doom the royal family, but would eventually lead to his own tragic downfall. Daedalus chose to help. Perhaps he was compelled by royal command, perhaps by fear, or perhaps by the terrible fascination of a technical challenge unlike any he had ever faced. Whatever his motivation, the master craftsman set to work on the most disturbing creation of his career. He would build a device that would allow a human woman to mate with a bull. The construction was a masterpiece of horrifying ingenuity. Daedalus created a hollow wooden cow, so perfectly crafted that it could fool even the divine bull itself. The frame was covered with real cowhide, complete with the scent and texture that would make the deception complete. Inside this grotesque contrivance, Pasiphae would hide, allowing the bull to mate with what it believed was another of its kind. The act itself was carried out in a meadow where the sacred bull normally grazed, far from the eyes of the court and the judgment of mortal witnesses. There, hidden within Daedalus's wooden creation, the queen of Crete fulfilled her cursed desire, completing an act so unnatural that it would forever alter the cosmic balance between divine and mortal worlds. 9 months later, Pasiphae gave birth to a creature that should never have existed. The child she bore was neither fully human nor fully beast, but a horrifying hybrid that embodied the violation of natural law that had created it. The infant had the body of a man but the head and tail of a bull, marking it as something that belonged neither to the world of humanity nor to the realm of animals. This was Asterion, the Minotaur, a living symbol of divine punishment and human transgression. Its very existence was an affront to the natural order, a creature that could never find a place in any civilized society. The monster child was proof that some boundaries were never meant to be crossed, and that the consequences of defying the gods could echo through generations in ways too terrible to imagine. Terrible to imagine. When King Minos first laid eyes upon his monstrous grandchild, the emotion that filled his heart was not love or pity, but pure, undiluted horror. The creature that crawled before him was an abomination, a living reminder of his own transgression against the gods. Yet even in his revulsion, the king understood that this beast was bound to his bloodline by chains of divine punishment that could never be broken. The Minotaur could not be killed without bringing further wrath upon Crete, but neither could it be allowed to roam free among his subjects. The solution Minos conceived was as brilliant as it was cruel. Once again, he summoned Daedalus to his court, the same craftsman whose genius had enabled the creature's unholy birth. But this time, the commission would be different. Instead of creating a device to fulfill unnatural desire, Daedalus would design the ultimate prison, a structure so complex and disorienting that escape would be impossible for any being, mortal or divine. The labyrinth that Daedalus constructed beneath the palace of Knossos was not merely a maze. It was an architectural nightmare, a three-dimensional puzzle of corridors, chambers, and false passages that defied human comprehension. The master craftsman poured all of his genius into creating a structure so bewildering that even he, its creator, barely managed to find his way out after its completion. The walls twisted and turned in patterns that seemed to follow no earthly logic, creating a space where direction lost all meaning and hope died in the endless shadows. At the heart of this impossible maze lay the creature's lair, a circular chamber where the Minotaur would spend its existence in perpetual darkness. The beast that had been born from divine curse and human hubris was now condemned to a life of eternal imprisonment, prowling the same corridors day after day, year after year, with no hope of escape or redemption. The labyrinth became both tomb and temple, a monument to the consequences of defying the natural order. But the horror of the Minotaur's existence extended far beyond the walls of its prison. The creature's appetite was not that of a normal beast. It hungered for human flesh, specifically the tender meat of young men and women in the prime of their lives. This cannibalistic craving was not born of mere bestial instinct, but seemed to be another layer of the divine curse that had created it. The monster required not just sustenance, but sacrifice, a ritualistic feeding that would transform the labyrinth into a temple of death. The opportunity for this grotesque sacrament came from an unexpected source. Across the wine-dark sea, in the city of Athens, a tragic event would provide King Minos with both justification for war and a ready supply of victims for his imprisoned monster. Androgeus, the king's beloved son and heir, had traveled to Athens to participate in the great athletic festivals that celebrated human achievement and divine favor. But during these competitions, whether through accident, treachery, or simple misfortune, the young prince met his death on foreign soil. When word of his son's demise reached Crete, Minos erupted with a grief and rage that shook the very foundations of his kingdom. The king who had once defied Poseidon himself now turned his fury toward the mortals he blamed for his loss. He assembled the greatest fleet the Mediterranean had ever seen, a armada of black-sailed warships that carried the vengeance of Crete across the waters to the mainland of Greece. The siege of Athens was swift and merciless. The Cretan fleet blockaded the harbor, while Minos's armies surrounded the city walls, cutting off all hope of escape or relief. The Athenians, proud descendants of heroes and philosophers, found themselves trapped like rats in their own acropolis, watching helplessly as their food stores dwindled and their children grew thin with hunger. Faced with the complete destruction of their city, the Athenian elders were forced to accept whatever terms Minos chose to impose. But the king of Crete did not seek gold or territory as compensation for his son's death. His price was far more precious and infinitely more terrible. Every 9 years, Athens would send 14 of its noblest young citizens to Crete as tribute. 7 young men and 7 young women, chosen from the finest families in the city, would sail across the sea to meet their doom in the depths of the labyrinth. This was no ordinary tribute payment. This was a ritualistic sacrifice designed to feed the monster that lurked beneath Knossos, a systematic offering of human life to appease the cursed appetite of the Minotaur. The young Athenians would be delivered directly into the maze, where they would wander in terror and confusion until the beast found them in the darkness. There would be no weapons, no armor, no hope of defense. They were not warriors sent to battle a monster, but lambs led to slaughter. The psychological impact of this tribute system on Athens was devastating. Every 9th year, the city would be gripped by a collective horror as families realized their children might be chosen for this death sentence. The selection process itself became a ritual of communal grief, as lots were drawn and names were called, transforming loving parents into mourners before their children had even departed. The black-sailed ship that carried the tribute to Crete became known as the Vessel of Sorrows, its departure marking the beginning of a journey from which no passenger would ever return. For the young victims themselves, the voyage to Crete must have been a nightmare of anticipation. They knew their fate awaited them in the depths of the labyrinth, knew that they sailed toward a death more horrible than any warrior could face in honest battle. They would not die with sword in hand, fighting for glory or defending their homeland. They would die lost and alone in the darkness, torn apart by claws and teeth in a place where no one would ever hear their screams. The tribute continued for generation after generation, each cycle claiming another 14 young lives and deepening the well of hatred between Athens and Crete. The Minotaur's hunger became a constant shadow over Athenian society, a reminder that even the greatest cities could be brought low by the whims of distant kings and the appetites of impossible monsters. Yet within this seemingly endless cycle of sacrifice and suffering, a different kind of story was taking shape. In the royal palace of Athens, a young prince was growing to manhood, watching the ships of sorrow depart his harbor and listening to the tales of the beast that devoured his people. This prince would not accept that Athens must forever pay this terrible price, that their children must continue to feed the monster's endless hunger. His name was Theseus, and he would soon volunteer to sail with the tribute ships, not as a victim, but as a hero determined to end the curse of the Minotaur once and for all. And for all. The Minotaur once, the ship that carried Theseus toward his destiny, cut through waters that had witnessed countless tragedies. its black sails billowing like the wings of death itself. But this voyage was different from all those that had come before. Among the 14 young Athenians chosen for sacrifice sailed a prince who carried with him not resignation, but a burning determination to break the cycle of horror that had claimed so many innocent lives. Theseus was no ordinary tribute victim. As the son of King Aegeus, he possessed both the physical prowess of a warrior and the cunning mind of a future ruler. More importantly, he carried within him the divine blood of Poseidon, though this heritage remained hidden even from himself. The same god whose curse had created the Minotaur had also blessed this young hero with the strength needed to confront it. When the Athenian ship reached the harbor of Crete, the tribute victims were marched through streets lined with silent crowds who watched their procession with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The Cretans had grown accustomed to these ritual arrivals, these deliveries of fresh meat for their imprisoned monster. But they had never seen a tribute who walked with the bearing of a king, whose eyes burned not with terror, but with purpose. In the palace of Knossos, King Minos received the Athenian youths with the cold satisfaction of a man who had grown accustomed to extracting his pound of flesh. But his daughter Ariadne, watching from the shadows of the court, felt her heart stirred by something she had never experienced before. When her gaze fell upon Theseus, she saw not a sacrificial victim, but a hero whose nobility shone like a beacon in the darkness of her father's cruel justice. The Princess of Crete was no stranger to the horrors that lurked beneath her home. She had grown up knowing that somewhere in the depths below, her monstrous half-brother prowled corridors that had claimed the lives of hundreds of young souls. She had listened to the screams that sometimes echoed up from the labyrinth, had seen the bones that were occasionally brought up from its depths. The curse that had created the Minotaur had cast its shadow over her entire life. But Ariadne also knew secrets that no other living soul possessed. As a child, she had explored passages that connected to the labyrinth's outer chambers, had discovered hidden routes that Daedalus himself had forgotten in his haste to escape his own creation. She understood the maze's twisted logic in ways that even its architect could not, having spent years mapping its peripheral corridors and studying its bewildering geometry. When Ariadne approached Theseus in the darkness before his scheduled descent into the maze, she offered him not just her love, but the tools necessary for survival. From her robes, she produced a ball of golden thread, spun from the finest silk in her father's treasury. This simple gift would prove more valuable than any weapon, for it offered something that no previous victim had possessed: a way home from the heart of darkness. The thread was more than mere string. It was a lifeline that would anchor Theseus to the world of the living, a connection to hope in a place designed to destroy all trace of humanity. As Ariadne explained its use, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was attempting, both lovers understood that they were not merely planning an escape, but challenging the very foundations of divine punishment that had created this nightmare. The entrance to the labyrinth yawned before Theseus, like the mouth of hell itself, a portal carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The opening was just wide enough for a single person to pass through, forcing each victim to enter alone, already isolated from their companions, before they had taken their first step into the maze. Ancient symbols were carved around the doorway, warnings in a script so old that even the palace scribes could no longer read them. As Theseus fastened one end of Ariadne's thread to an iron ring beside the entrance, he could hear the other tribute victims being led to different openings scattered throughout the palace grounds. The labyrinth was not a single maze, but a network of interconnected passages that ensured the victims would remain separated, unable to help one another or combine their strength against the monster that hunted them. Each would face their terror alone, as the curse demanded. The first steps into the labyrinth revealed the true genius of Daedalus's design. The corridor immediately split into three directions, each path appearing identical to the others, but leading to vastly different destinations within the maze. The walls were constructed from massive blocks of fitted stone, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of moisture from the underground springs that fed the complex. Strange acoustics carried sounds in impossible directions, so that footsteps seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air within the maze was thick with the smell of ancient death, a cloying sweetness that spoke of countless victims who had wandered these passages before meeting their doom in the creature's claws. Phosphorescent fungi grew in patches on the walls, providing just enough light to reveal the path ahead while casting everything else into deeper shadow. This was illumination, designed to torment rather than guide, showing the lost just enough to keep them moving toward their inevitable fate. As Theseus moved deeper into the maze, carefully unwinding Ariadne's thread behind him, he began to understand the psychological torture that Daedalus had woven into the very architecture. The passages followed no logical pattern, turning back on themselves in ways that defied spatial reasoning. Corridors that should have led upward instead descended into deeper darkness, while paths that seemed to promise escape instead led to dead ends decorated with the bones of previous victims. The myth of the Minotaur is far more than a simple tale of heroes and monsters. It is a story that reveals the darkest truths about divine justice, human hubris, and the terrible prices we pay for defying the natural order. From Minos's fatal arrogance to the cursed birth of Asterion, from the nightmare architecture of the labyrinth to the systematic sacrifice of innocent lives, this ancient tale continues to haunt us because it speaks to our deepest fears about what we might become when we cross the boundaries that should never be crossed. In the end, the true horror of the Minotaur was never the beast itself, but the human choices that created it.